Welcome once again to Good Shepherd Lutheran Church and Lutheran Campus Ministry in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This is a sermon for the fifth Sunday after Pentecost. Today's reading from the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, is where we get the confusing text quoted by Matthew that portrays Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday as riding on both a donkey and the colt or the foal of a donkey. Somehow it got mistranslated or written incorrectly because Zechariah clearly wrote about a king who is coming, a good king who makes all things right, a humble king riding on a donkey, a mere colt of a donkey. That is to say that this one who is coming to lead the people has had it with war. No more chariots. War horses be gone. No more swords and spears or bows and arrows. Or, as Arlo Guthrie sang in Alice's Restaurant, one of the great anti-war songs, no more implements of destruction. Although Arlo was singing about shovels and rakes, tools to actually pick up the garbage. Well, this leader that Zechariah spoke of will offer peace to the world, from the four winds to the seven seas. We continue to read the text as recorded by Matthew, but it's okay if we get it wrong because, as a colleague says, well, we undermeant what it stand. There is another thing that is on target for us today. Through Zechariah, God is also speaking about reparations. Come home, prisoners. I am declaring that everything you lost will be returned twice over. Justice restored requires some type of reparations for what was taken. As we struggle with our own history and we ask important questions about what is just and right for indigenous peoples and for African Americans in our country, we ought to be reading our sacred scriptures. Grace is free. Loving the neighbor has a cost. The cost is a payback for what was taken. It's a proper investment in a future that includes justice because justice is God's way and it is the right thing to do. It's an interesting image in Zechariah that the one that we follow comes to us. We can't and we should not try to force it. As we are hoping and planning, as we work and follow Jesus, we ought not harm each other for peace' sake. Our call and our hope is to live into the recognition that we are bound to one another, peoples and nations together. Peacemakers, zealous ones for peace. Don't destroy each other in the process. No one rides to war on a donkey. Be humble as you work for peace. Now I'm going to switch topics. Paul's letter to the Romans reminded me of a few Januaries ago. Julie and I were kayaking in Florida Bay to camp on Nest Key, which is a mangrove island about 5 miles out into the ocean from Key Largo. And yes, of course, our song became the theme from Gilligan's Island because, like Gilligan's crew and passengers, we too thought it would be just a 3-hour tour, both as we paddled out to the island and then on the return trip, in which we charted a different course and may have gotten just a little lost. The waterways in Florida, within the area known as the Keys, which are islands, the waterways are labeled as creeks. Now, growing up in South Dakota, I knew what creeks look like in South Dakota. These Florida creeks are unlike any creek that I had ever seen before. They are super highways for kayakers, and huge jet skis with 4 or 5 drunk people on them going 70 miles an hour. So we're paddling around these twists and turns of these creeks, and then we had to take our paddles and wave them overhead back and forth so these demons on steroids could see us and not smash us into gator bites. The wake alone was enough to swamp us. It's the wake that we leave behind us that I was reminded of in Paul's words. The good that I would, I do not do. Using Eugene Peterson's translation, what I don't understand about myself is that I decide one way, but then I act another, doing things that I absolutely despise. It's like there's this little voice in my head, or a giant voice in my body that contradicts what I know is right and good for me, and thus for the world around me too. I can will it, but I can't seem to do it. I mean well, I really do, but I don't always do what is wrong. I just do it enough times that it begins to swell around me, and then like a wake behind me, it leaves all kinds of detritus behind. That's a great word, isn't it? Detritus. When's the last time you heard or used the word detritus? If I can't trust myself to do what is best for me, and you can't be trusted to do what is best for me, no, for you, well, what then? What then? What are we left with? Grace. As Dan Erlander used to say, grace, 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 grace. All that we have when the wake powerfully washes over us and swamps us, all we have left over is grace. All that's left when all else is washed away is grace. Maps typically have legends. And last week's passage from Romans 6 is the legend. It's the explanation for following the map through the twists and turns of our lives. Now, when we were in the Keys in Florida, it would have been nice to have a map with a legend that actually defined creek for us. Well, actually, we would have gotten lost anyway. But what the Apostle Paul explained is that we have forgiveness. We are forgiven. That's the legend in the map. That's grace. And then he asks, should we just keep causing these destructive wakes so more grace washes over us? No, absolutely not. In Romans 7, Paul writes, like a very astute observer of human behavior, he knows this is not some thought experiment or speculation on the human predicament. This is real stuff that deals with real people. We want to do what is right, but then we lie to ourselves, and we like to think that our personal sins affect only me. They're like victimless crimes, right? Except they're not. They have an energy of their own, and soon you have this wake following behind you that instead of dissipating, increases and becomes a tsunami. Paul eventually gets to this. Just as one person's propensity to mess things up infects the world around them exponentially, affecting a community and then eventually becoming built into our institutions that are supposed to actually do good things for people, the opposite can happen too. One person's goodness is poured out and fills many. That too can change the world. Paul's point is that in Jesus we have this one person's goodness that is poured out for us and upon us. This is the same guy who humbly rode into Jerusalem on a colt instead of a war horse. But I refuse to talk about what Jesus does in a way that suggests some kind of vicarious atonement or salvation that somehow magically cleanses us or vaccinates us against becoming ill. Grace ain't like that. Grace doesn't mean that I won't screw up again. Grace does mean that when I do screw up, there is no condemnation. I may be and should be convicted. Instead, I am set free to go back into my world and try harder to be well and to help others be well. That kind of wake that Jesus creates will surround us, and it will buoy us up, and it has an even greater power to leave in its wake good and life-sustaining things. It's easy to find oneself in rough waters because of decisions that we personally make or that someone else makes that can last forever, for generations. Breaking the cycle can be really, really hard. What Paul is saying, I think, and many religious perspectives and many psychologies will tell you this, it's easier to break the cycle when there is something buoying you up, keeping you afloat. It might be the power of a healing community, a support group. It could be the depths of prayer and meditation. It could be a sponsor or a religious practice, or even a quiet walk in the woods or a kayak outing, maybe in the middle of the night when there are no crazy jet skis to contend with. When we go underwater, we find, or we are found by, God's grace. That means that whether you believe that you are essentially flawed, or that you are essentially good and just make bad decisions, or whether you are more comfortable in the classic Christian understanding that we are both saint and sinner, no matter how you understand your identity, there is no condemnation. Whether or not you feel like you are okay, God says you are okay. When we are overwhelmed by rough waters, God throws us a life preserver. And it sounds a little trite to say this, but Jesus is that life preserver, or that buoy in the night that gives you a direction. Or in our case, when we were in the Keys, that boater that came by to see if we were okay. 3 times. I mentioned earlier about not forcing things that we believe upon others. It's ironic that one cannot force grace upon the world. It doesn't work that way. If and when we figure out that we are judged with love and forgiveness, and not with punishment and damnation, we are not allowed to turn around and judge others. Our task is to continually make decisions on how we act and respond to others and pour out on them the same grace and forgiveness that has been poured out upon us. We can only change ourselves. Now, that is not to say that anyone, including ourselves, is free from accountability. Should we just keep overwhelming the world in our wake of destruction so God and grace have something to do? No. We all want things to change for the better right now. True change is only possible through grace that keeps us afloat and then guides us to a safe harbor. Amen.